Coming up on the Threat Status podcast, we talk to retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies about what he makes of President Trump's Golden Dome announcement, the threat from Chinese cyberattacks, and how the U.S. can still help Ukraine win its war with Russia. And then we break down the Trump administration's major shift on Syria policy, the Trump phone call with Vladimir Putin, and new threats from Russian hackers. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times. My esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times, will be back next week, but we still have a packed show for you. Later, we talk to Mark Montgomery of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies about his recent trip to Ukraine and what he makes of this week's Golden Dome announcement by President Trump. But before we get there are a few things on my radar this week, and let me touch on the Golden Dome announcement briefly. President Trump said the system, expected to be the most advanced and comprehensive missile shield ever developed, will be up and running in 3 years to protect the U.S. from cruise, ballistic, and hypersonic missile attacks from Russia, China, and other adversaries. Trump, as we all expected, chose General Michael Gutlein, the Space Force's Vice Chief of Space Operations, to run the project. Mark Montgomery and I talk about that in more detail later, but one more thing to highlight quickly on the Golden Dome. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said he envisions a system in which numerous Golden Dome capabilities on the ground, in the air, at sea, and especially in space can, quote, speak to each other, unquote. That would seem to suggest that artificial intelligence and autonomous systems, as we expect, will help drive the groundbreaking network of satellite sensors, interceptors, and other assets that will make up the Golden Dome. We got into that in more detail last week at a Threat Status event in Pentagon City, and Guy Taylor moderated a panel discussion specifically focused on that kind of technology. So I would encourage listeners who want to know more about sort of the nuts and bolts of the Golden Dome to go watch that discussion on the special Golden Dome page of the Washington Times website. On the geopolitical front, we need to discuss the Trump administration's shift on Syria. Now, I had an exclusive interview this week with Michael Anton, director of the policy planning staff at the State Department, who pushed back pretty hard on claims that he and perhaps others were working behind the scenes to slow down or undermine President Trump's decision to rapidly remove all of the economic sanctions on Syria. Anton said there's no truth to that, and that he, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, other key officials, basically anybody with any power and influence at high levels over diplomacy and geopolitics in this administration is on board with President Trump's decision on sanctions. Trump, of course, made the announcement about lifting Syria sanctions last week when he met in Saudi Arabia with new Syrian President Ahmad al-Shara. Al-Shara led a rebel alliance last December that overthrew longtime Syrian dictator Bashar Assad. And while Trump had a lot of positive things to say about al-Shara, there is a lot of concern about his past ties to al-Qaeda and what that means for sort of the structure of the Syrian government led by al-Shara going forward. Bill Roggio and Ahmad Sharawi, also of FDD, had a troubling new analysis this week about the new Syrian government, how it may be integrating a Central Asian terrorist group, the Turkestan Islamic Party, part of al-Qaeda's network, into its own military. So look, Trump wants to lift sanctions on Syria because he thinks a stable Syria can be a cog in a regional alliance to counter Iran. He thinks maybe he can get Syria to join the Abraham Accords and formally recognize Israel's right to exist. He thinks Syria could take some counterterrorism burden off the U.S. and that the country will be an attractive place for American investment dollars for years to come. And maybe all of that is true, but there's still a danger here. The alliance that al-Shara led has a lot of disparate elements in it. Al-Shara probably isn't the only one with past ties to terror groups, or perhaps some of these folks have current ties to terror groups. There's a lot we don't know about this alliance and sort of what's going on at the ground level right now in Syria. So I hope this works out. We all do, because a stable Syria is a good thing for the U.S., for the region, and for the world. But we can't gloss over the risks here, because this kind of thing could go sideways in a hurry. So we'll certainly monitor that here at Threat Status. One more point on President Trump. He had his long-awaited phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin earlier this week. He came out of that call and said that Russia and Ukraine would immediately begin peace talks. But the Kremlin on Thursday said Russia and Ukraine have no direct peace talks scheduled. This is just days after Putin said Russia was ready to work with Ukraine on a framework for a possible peace treaty. Remember, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has expressed openness to meeting face-to-face with Putin to discuss a ceasefire. Putin is the one who chose not to do that, and presumably Russia is the one that's standing in the way of more peace talks right now. We've talked a lot on the show about whether Putin is just trying to buy time. It seems clear the Russian military is gearing up, based on all analysis that I've seen, is gearing up for a major offensive in the coming weeks. Maybe Putin's making a bet that he'll be in a better position, will have more leverage a few months from now than he does at this current moment. What I wonder is whether the Trump administration is going to play hardball and impose secondary tariffs or sanctions on Russia's oil industry. I get into that in more detail now with Mark Montgomery in this exclusive Threat Status interview. And we are joined now by retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery. He's the co-leader of the Air and Missile Defense Program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, the senior director of FDD's Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation, among many other projects that you're involved with, Mark. It's a pleasure as always. Thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, thank you very much for having me, Ben.
Of course. Let's start with this. So last week, I was fortunate enough to moderate a panel discussion at the Threat Status Golden Dome for America event in Pentagon City that included you, Mark, as well as Tom Carrico from CSIS, Tori Bruno of the United Launch Alliance, and Erica Marshall of Lockheed Martin. And yesterday, President Trump announced that his administration is moving ahead with its architecture for the Golden Dome and expects it to be up and running in 3 years. As we expected, Space Force Vice Chief of Space Operations, General Michael Gutlein, will lead the effort. So, Mark, what did you make of what we heard yesterday? Do you still have any outstanding questions? And I guess, big picture, can this actually get done in 3 years?
So, hey, thanks. And I'm glad you had that event, a week ago, because practically you got an exclusive. It's like both myself and Tom Carrico told you that it'd probably be Mike Gutlein, as you said, the vice chief of the Space Force right now. And really uniquely, I have to give President Trump and Secretary Hegseth a lot of credit. They have taken the one service member who has both deep, Space Force leadership experience as vice chief, a 4-star there, and significant Missile Defense Agency experience, where he was a deputy as a 1-star, ran, I believe, the test and evaluation programs, or the program management efforts. So really, he has extensive experience in both missile defense and in space. He is the right person to lead this, and I'm confident, having heard him speak a few times and talked with him personally, that he has the right vision of what this needs to be. And President Trump said that too. This is a space-based vision. There will be other elements, but this is inherently a space-based vision. Now, the one place where I think President Trump might have gotten slightly off track is when he said it's going to be done in 3 years. Not going to be done in 3 years. And I'm confident what he was briefed on was we'll have some initial operational capabilities in 3 years. But the critical asset list of America, what we'd like to defend will not match the defended asset list, that which we can actually defend in 3 years. It might in 7 years, it might in 10 years, but it takes a visionary, thoughtful leader, a visionary leader by the president and a thoughtful leader like Gutlein to get us from where we are today to where we need to be 7 to 10 years from now with a defended homeland.
I want to drill in on one more thing about the Golden Dome that you said last week at our event. I asked you if SpaceX, Palantir, and Anduril are an alliance of those companies, or some way those three companies could be the leaders of the Golden Dome project. And it seems they'll have some role at least. But you brought up this idea of the Golden Dome, missile defense as a service. And you said it would be quite stupid to do it that way. Can you explain for our listeners who might not know what exactly that means, the idea of Golden Dome as a service service provided by private companies.
Yeah, first, I want to make clear those three companies, SpaceX will do a lot of the launch. SpaceX is the reason we can do that. You got to give them a lot of credit. They've driven down the cost of space launch 90+%. A handful of companies led by SpaceX. Palantir will be part of this. Palantir is building the kind of tools that can mesh all the sensors and shooters, and this is going to take a incredibly complex mesh to bring everything together. And I think Palantir's there. And then Anduril is dropping the cost of intercept and some of the stuff they're doing, and that needs to happen here. So I imagine all three of these companies are going to be part of it. What they won't be is they won't be it. There will be many, many other companies. There's small companies out there I've seen with phenomenal tools, particularly on the attack side, that are gonna be purchased maybe by one of those three, maybe by Lockheed or Raytheon, whomever. There are gonna be a lot of other players in this. Okay. Now, with that said, here's another thing it won't be. It won't be something provided as a service. That's not how we roll in our U.S. military. We got a couple governing rules. One, we fight under a U.S. commander, which is why SAC here should and will always be a U.S. four-star. And we own our own tools. We don't lease or rent your tool to go use. We don't call Lockheed Martin up and say, "Can we have 10 F-35s, on layaway, or on lease?" Right? We buy them. We operate them. We offer sometimes other countries government-owned contractor-operated or contractor-owned contractor. I get that. But that's not how the United States military fights, and it won't be how we fight here. We are going to own and operate the equipment that composes Golden Dome, just like we do every other warfare area, Ben.
You're confident in that, even with President Trump obviously being, close with Elon Musk, for example, and some of the other companies. You're confident the administration won't drift in that direction with this?
I am. I'm confident that there are enough 3 and 4 stars still left after the 20% cut to make sure that doesn't happen.
Okay. One last thing before we get to Ukraine. You testified last week before the House Select Committee in the Chinese Communist Party and talked about how a conflict across the Taiwan Strait would almost certainly lead to major Chinese cyber attacks on critical U.S. infrastructure. Now, when you and I talked, I think back in December, early January on this show, before Trump came into office, you said you thought there were 2 big areas he could make significant progress on in defending the U.S. homeland: missile defense and cyber. We've talked about the missile defense side of this, but what about the cyber side of this? Are you satisfied with what you've seen from the Trump administration on that front?
Well, not yet, and I wouldn't be in a Harris administration at this point either. We're in a 25-year deficit on cybersecurity. What I mean by that is, what I said to you was, look, when we think about defense of the homeland, we tend to think about the border. The reality is our 2 adversaries have said, yes, that's interesting, but where we can absolutely apply an asymmetric advantage is in cyber and in missile attack. And the missile attack, you're starting to see the Golden Dome go at it again, not going to solve the problem for 5 to 7 to 10 years. And in cyber, we've got to figure out how to protect our critical infrastructures. Because what I said in my testimony and what I've said to you is that when we decide to go fight somebody, the stuff has to leave our forts and get to our ports or get to our airfields to get overseas. And the rail networks, the airfields, and there's 40,000 miles of rail network, 69 airfields, and 19 ports. What I just mentioned is 90% owned and operated by the private sector or state and local utilities, not the federal government. And it is protected as if it was owned by state and local utilities and the private sector and not the federal government. And until we get the right cybersecurity standards applied to those, China's going to go crazy. And in case we didn't know that they knew, Volt Typhoon, which was revealed last spring to be a Chinese operational preparation of the battlefield, where they've actually put either accesses or actual malware so they can get back in later for a disruptive or destructive attack on that critical infrastructure. So the Chinese know it. We know it. We got to fix it. It's a 5 to 10 year process that really is not kicked off in this administration yet.
Every time I bring up offensive cyber operations, I know it's a tricky sort of classified area, but is there a mutually assured destruction kind of principle at work here with that kind of stuff, that they know that if we wanted to, we have the capability to do, as bad or worse things to them as well?
I think probably in day-to-day operations, that's why they don't do things like just take down some power grid for the fun of it. But in a warlike time period, or in a build-up to a crisis, when we're starting to move forces, they will use this tool. Here's the problem. They're fighting interior lines of communication, particularly the Chinese. They don't have this kind of fort to port problem. The state owns everything they're transporting on. They're maintaining a certain level of cybersecurity. I don't think we're going to have the access and availability to do a similar attack on them. And it won't have the same impact. We are critical to Taiwan. in a way that there's no equal in the world. So from my perspective, this is really a U.S. defensive problem.
Let's get to Ukraine. You just returned from Ukraine recently. Can you explain sort of what you were doing over there and the mood among the Ukrainian troops that you spoke with?
Yeah, so myself and a few other general officers are part of a team of field grade, these all retired field grade officers as well that do education and some training among their units, either on operational planning, on the U.S., how the U.S. organizes forces, things like that, so that these units have taken on a lot of U.S. tools, systems, weapons, have the proper doctrine to use it, because that's not necessarily part of the training program that was pushed very aggressively over the last 3 years. And we don't have active duty in country in that manner. And so we get an opportunity to see, corps level units, naval units, air units as part of an education program. And then we also work with their Ministry of Defense, their education institutes, their general staff to do some of the kind of things like what it's like to be a European military. If you were to ever join NATO or join a European coalition, what you have to de-Sovietize in your system. And the Ukrainians still have some Soviet legacy things like in their military judicial systems or their recruiting systems, things like that. But probably the most important thing I did was observe their F-16 units this last time.
What was the morale? What's the sense over there? Because I think with the way the administration has been approaching, peace negotiations, both the Russia-Ukraine and then our talks directly with Russia, there seems to be kind of this undercurrent that, well, not an undercurrent, it's been explicitly stated by J.D. Vance and Secretary Hegseth and others that they're not going to get all their territory back. In other words, they're not going to achieve what their objective for winning the war is. Do you get that sense from the folks that you spoke with in Ukraine? Do they still believe they can, quote unquote, win this war, whatever that looks like?
Yeah, so they're dogged, they're persistent, and they know that they can stop Russia on the offense, and they believe that they will eventually outlast Russia's resilience. That's a positive takeaway. Look, each time I go there, it's a little, there's a little more war weariness, particularly among the senior officers. I mean, these colonels and generals have been fighting, the good ones, the skilled ones, for 24 to 36 months out of the last 36 months. The ones I've met with have lost sons, brothers, real high level combat casualties in the immediate families. And, it both is weighs on them, but it also, instills them with strength that they're gonna defeat the Russians. And I really believe at their core level, they believe that.
What do they need from us right now? There was a lot of talk throughout the Biden administration, of course. In fact, I think you and I have talked about this before, about the slow walking of certain, U.S. capabilities that the Biden administration ultimately ended up delivering months, or sometimes close to a year after Ukraine initially asked for them. What do they want right now? If the Trump administration were to kind of change its approach to this and decide to, commit fully to helping Ukraine to the biggest degree we can, what do they want? What do they need?
So first, I'd say they are disappointed in the Trump administration's cutting off of presidential drawdown authority. They apparently no more grant packages. They think they're carrying the fight forward for all of democracy against an authoritarian. That does disappoint them. They were disappointed with the Biden administration for the exact reasons you said. Things like F-16s coming late, M1A1s coming late, ATACMS coming very late, particularly ATACMS. Some Gimlers, some of the other issues, things that, from the beginning of the war through 2.5 years were really slow coming. Okay. That's all in the rearview mirror. Looking forward, they got to have two things from us. One is time-sensitive targeting. We provided that it's gotten better and better and better. It's really situational awareness tools. I call time-sensitive targeting, but it lets them see an attack coming farther out than their own intelligence agencies might provide. It comes from overhead imagery. Trump cut it off after the disastrous Oval Office meeting for about 7 to 10 days, and it hurt. It's back now. It needs to stay back. It's a great defensive tool for them. It gives them warning, so they have a better chance of shooting down cruise, hypersonic or cruise and ballistic missiles and drones coming at them. Okay. The second thing they need is access to the U.S. defense industrial base. Again, America's not going to give them anything, but will America sell them or Europeans on behalf of the Ukrainians the munitions necessary to be used from the Patriot missile system, the NASAMS missile system, which is AMRAAM missiles, the 155 ATACMS would be great. Those kind of systems. And when you ask what would they need all of them. They need the 2 air defense missiles, Patriot and AMRAAM, so that they can defend their critical infrastructures in their core, big cities. 155 for exchange on the battlefield. And they need the ATACMS, because it gives them an opportunity with the better targeting thing now to really impose their will on concentrated Russian units back in Russian territory or just on the fringes of Ukrainian former, Ukrainian sovereign territory that Russia holds.
Mark, is there anything else that we, the U.S., could have provided to Ukraine?
Now, I'm glad you brought that up because one of the things that shocked me that I did not understand over the last 2.5 years is that we're not providing life cycle maintenance with these equipment. So when you buy like an F-35 in the United States, you pay 75 million and you get an F-35, but you also pay some other amount, say 25 to 50 million, and you get a life cycle maintenance cost. Well, when we're pushing stuff to Ukraine like we've been pushing it in PDA, particularly, we just give you the stuff. Now, for munitions, that's fine. It goes in, it goes out of a tube, and impacts the enemy. But when we give you an F-16, now you got to maintain it, and you really need that life cycle maintenance. So F-16 stuff, when I was looking around there with my friend, Major General Corky Corcoran, retired U.S. Air Force, they did not have all the supply parts you'd want. They didn't have all the right munitions. They didn't have all these things, maintenance gear, stuff like that. Good news is the Trump administration, as part of the critical minerals deal, approved a $310 million package of tools. This is very late. This should have come a year ago. I'm glad it's now. I don't know how it's going to deliver. We need to expedite it. If I can mention one other thing, they need a different weapon. It's called the APKWS. It's a 2.75-inch rocket. It's fired. You can have 14 to 28 of them on an F-16. You can take out Shaheeds. So instead of using a $500,000 AIM-9M or AIM-9X Sparrow, you can use a $7,000 or $8,000 rocket that uses a sniper pod, laser pod to get at it. It is an obvious 99% reduction in intercept costs that we need to give our Ukrainian partners. So, number one thing we gotta do is get life cycle maintenance right on these high-end things like the F-16 and make sure they have the right weapon systems.
That's a great segue, Mark, because I was going to ask you to kind of flip this around for a second. Where is Russia vulnerable? If Ukraine were to kind of take the fight to the Russians, as we saw with the Kursk offensive last year, are there holes that can be exploited in the Russian military right now?
Well, look, I continue to believe there's got to be a limit to their recruiting drives, right? And they are using people in a way, that only Stalin would appreciate, right? It's not wrong to say they were having 1,500 casualties a day. Those aren't just deaths and wounded and captured. About 1,500 a day during this most recent offensive. That's a lot. And it wasn't really a full-scale offensive. I expect to see that again in a month or two. But that's a lot of people. And I think they're out of criminals. I think they've really stretched the recruitment or the impressment or drafting of minorities inside Russia. So now you're talking about Slavic Russians from, west of the Urals, St. Petersburg, Moscow. To me, that's going to have a serious impact on national morale if they start to have the same kind of casualty rates. So we'll have to see what happens. To me, that's a weakness. The second, and the other weakness, I should have said this one first, is their economy. It's obvious that what we have to do is secondary sanctions on their oil and natural gas. That means hitting the Chinese and Indian companies that are buying this stuff. I think the Chinese ones would immediately back off. I think even the Indian ones would. India is just trying to make a buck, to drive their economy. China, it's part of supporting Russia, but these companies don't want to get into trouble with U.S. financial services systems like SWIFT and other things. If we do real sanctions there, that sales of oil and natural gas funds about 40% of the Russian economy. That Russian economy is spent, in defense, in government spending is 40% on defense. So if you can draw that down, you force Putin to choose between paying for defense and paying for the rest of his budget, which is, payments to the base, kind of like we do in our country, right? And if the babushkas aren't getting their payments, they're going to be unhappy and his base is unhappy. And if the military doesn't get their payments, he can't execute this war. So to me, his vulnerabilities are deaths on the battlefield and economic depravity, in both cases, driving down public support for the war.
Yeah. Last thing, Mark, and I always hesitate to ask put somebody in the position of explaining what a dictator like Vladimir Putin is thinking at any given time. But what do you make of sort of the way this is going back and forth? The am I going to go to Istanbul for these talks, and he decides not to go, and then the call with Trump a couple of days ago. Do you have a good sense of kind of where he is? Does he want peace right now in any meaningful way?
No. And I'm surprised that he hasn't taken advantage of this. In other words, everyone says Putin's this crafty, authoritarian. Well, if he was truly crafty, he would have embraced Trump's offers, not really done anything about them. He did this in a way by saying, I'll go to Istanbul, but then not going. He kind of rejected. Eventually, look, either Trump's going to tire him or he's not. If he's not going to ever tire of him, there's nothing the rest of us can do about it. But Putin is, I think, misplayed his hand here. He is constantly showing up Trump. He's constantly not doing what's necessary. It's an easy yes for Trump to go yes on those secondary sanctions, and it would be painful for Russia. So I do not believe Putin's interested in these. He seems to believe that a summer offensive will push through and get him more territory, achieve more, pull victory from the jaws of defeat, which is what this 3 years has been for him. And so I don't think he's given up on this war.
Mark Montgomery, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it, as always.
Thank you, Ben.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, weekly segment here on the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home domestically or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now, this week, as you all are listening to the show. And my threat of the week builds off of the Russia-Ukraine war, but it specifically deals with Russian hackers targeting Western technology and logistics companies, particularly those involved in the delivery of wartime aid to Ukraine. Friend of the show and Washington Times lead tech correspondent Ryan Lovelace dove into this story this week, and it's pretty troubling. The FBI, the National Security Agency, CISA, other arms of the U.S. federal government were among the U.S. agencies, along with agencies from allied governments in Europe, that warned about hacks by Russia's GRU Unit 26165, also known as Fancy Bear. There's a lot here, and the actual document itself paints a detailed picture of what the Russians are apparently trying to do, but here's just a quick sample. The Russian hackers sought access to IP cameras for visibility into sensitive locations, with the overwhelming majority, 81% of those cameras, appearing to be in Ukraine. In other words, they're trying to get more visibility into Ukraine. Now, the full list of the suspected targets is broad. It includes airports, other transportation hubs, air traffic management, the defense industry, IT services industry, and more, in more than a dozen countries, including, as you would expect, the United States and Ukraine. The report here is actually fascinating in that it goes into some incredible depth, including listing suspicious command lines and actual email addresses and other sort of technical terms used by the Russian hackers. We all know that Russian hacking, broadly speaking, is a big problem, but this is just another reminder of how significant a threat it can be to the U.S., to Ukraine, and to our other allies, and that's why it's my threat of the week. And with that, a big thank you to Mark Montgomery of FDD. A huge thanks to all of you, our listeners. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, and share the show with all of your friends. Guy Taylor will be back next week to join me here on the Threat Status Podcast.